first question I'd like to ask you, Salim, is what is the Climate Vulnerable Forum?
The Climate Vulnerable Forum is a group of vulnerable countries drawn from the main groups within the UNFCCC, which are the small island developing states, the least developed countries in Africa. And it was convened 2 years ago by President Nasheed of the Maldives in the run-up to Copenhagen to get leaders from these countries to engage on this issue and to have their voices at the more leadership global level rather than just a negotiations level. It's not a new negotiating bloc. It's just a coalition of countries that want to take action, want to go ahead and do something rather than just keep on talking about it. The forum then met again in Kiribati, hosted by President Tong of Kiribati the following year, last year. And this is now the third meeting that Bangladesh is hosting. It's grown to nearly 30 countries now from Asia, Africa, Latin America, and it's being represented here by ministers and senior officials from these countries. And the idea in this particular meeting is for these countries to come together and proclaim that they are not willing to, or they are not waiting for action at the global level or agreement at the global level. They're going to go ahead and do things, and indeed many of them are already doing things. Bangladesh, for example, has set up a climate change strategy and action plan. It has resourced that plan with about $300 million of its own money and is implementing it. So it's not waiting for the world to come and rescue it. It's going to help itself. And many of the other countries are doing something similar. Being vulnerable countries, the primary emphasis is obviously on adaptation to climate change, but that doesn't mean that they're not doing mitigation as well, and they're quite willing to do mitigation. One very good example of that is President Nasheed's promise to become carbon neutral, make the Maldives carbon neutral by 2020, which is a big ask given that they are dependent on fossil fuels like diesel for their electricity generation, but he's doing a lot of work on that dimension. The argument from these countries is that even if their emissions are small, they still will do whatever they can to reduce them because every little bit counts and because it's the right thing to do, not because they're being forced to do it. In fact, in the UNFCCC negotiations, quite often these countries are exempted from having to take mitigation actions because they're poor and vulnerable. But these countries are saying we don't need exemption. We want everybody to do it, and we are quite willing to do our bit. And they want to lead by example. So the idea is that this particular grouping of countries might become a moral leader, if you like, on the issue of climate change, not waiting for global agreements to occur in Durban or in the COPs, but taking action at home. And part of the meeting here is sharing those actions with each other, learning from each other, building up on what we are doing in each of the countries. Again, another good example is the fact that Bangladesh has set up a multi-donor climate change trust fund, which is now something that is becoming something of a model for many other developing countries who are thinking along the same lines, and some indeed have moved ahead on those lines. So there's a lot of learning and sharing that can take place, which is taking place. And the whole ethos is not sitting and waiting for a global agreement, but just going ahead and doing things, being vulnerable countries, appealing to others to take action as well, particularly the large emitting countries, both the rich emitting countries and the large developing countries, to take action as well. But not forcing them and not accusing them, but just appealing to them to do the right thing.
And do you think those appeals are being heard? Do you see rich countries moving towards taking action?
Yes and no. Certainly a lot of action is taking place in different countries, particularly in the large developing countries. Countries like China and India are definitely doing a lot. One must give them that. But collectively, we're not doing enough, and everybody recognizes that. So we need to up our ante and up our game in terms of doing more. My sense is that there is probably an appetite amongst certain people in these countries, and to a large extent, the appeal is not so much to the leaders who haven't done what they were supposed to do, but to the citizens of these countries, to tell them that the poor countries are actually taking the lead on this, and your countries should be doing the same, and hopefully maybe shaming them into taking action. There hasn't been a positive result that I can point to yet, but we're not giving up.
And how do you see the international dimension of this playing out within the UN? We've got important UN talks coming up in Durban later this month. How are the international negotiations on climate change going to move forward?
Well, one of the reasons for setting up this forum and continuing with it is the recognition that the international negotiations are not making progress. Since the debacle of Copenhagen, where we had high ambitions which were shattered and didn't happen, we have defaulted into a game of very low expectations. In Cancun, it was described as a success simply because it wasn't a failure. And we're going into Durban with similar sorts of realization that there's not going to be no breakthrough given the political situation in the United States of America. President Obama and his negotiating team could not pass anything in Congress that they agreed to in Durban, and everybody knows it, so nobody's going to deal with them. Because even if the rest of the world were to give in to everything the US negotiators asked for, when they went back to Washington, they wouldn't get it through Congress because they don't control Congress, and everybody knows that. So the US is out of the game. Now, the rest of the world may go ahead and do things. Hopefully there will be a coalition of the willing that will carry on. On the legally binding agreement and on mitigation targets, there's hardly anybody who expects an outcome. On adaptation and funding, we have higher hopes. There's good progress on adaptation, mainly because nobody disagrees that there shouldn't be adaptation. It's a sort of motherhood and apple pie issue that everybody can agree on. What the differences are on how much money and how to flow the money for it, and how to do it and who does it and so on. So they're more operational negotiations on the how rather than whether or not it should happen. And then the Green Climate Fund that will manage the $100 billion a year that has been promised from 2020 onwards is really the big thing up for negotiations that we hopefully will get a result on. But on the really big things in terms of the ambition, the mitigation targets, and the legally binding, nobody expects an outcome in Durban.
What do you think are going to be the sticking points in Durban? You've said nobody expects an outcome. What's causing the gridlock?
The gridlock is, as I said, the United States of America is simply not going to play ball. And given the political situation domestically in the US with the Republican Party and indeed the Tea Party of the Republican Party in the ascendancy, the White House has no leverage at all, even if they wanted to do things. And I believe they want to do things, but they can't. And everybody knows that. So if the US is not willing to do things, then other large countries like China, India, Brazil are unlikely to do, although everybody's doing voluntarily things. So that's the default, is everybody does voluntary targets, or NAMAs as they're termed, nationally appropriate mitigation actions, which they've all put on the table, but when you add them all up, we are headed for 4 degrees, not 2 degrees. If we want to get to 2 degrees, then they're going to have to ratchet those up considerably, and simply doing voluntary action is not going to do it.
So the political environment in the US isn't conducive to action, but how can we move the agenda forward? What's it going to take?
Well, I'll give you my personal opinion, and it's just, my crystal ball as good as anybody else's. I think the following. I think we are in a strategic retreat at the moment. The tide is against us to get good action at the global level. This won't last forever. It'll last for a while, and we'll come out of it at the other end in a few years' time. The science of climate change convinces everybody but the US. So we don't need more science because the US doesn't believe the science, or by and large citizens and by and large their Senate and their Republican parties. So science isn't going to convince them. What will convince them, in my view, is a sort of notion that is growing within the US of potential rivalry with the next superpower being China. And the moment they realize that China is actually going ahead and is going to beat them to the post-fossil fuel era with the post-fossil fuel technologies that China is investing heavily in and ramping up its ability to develop, then the US will turn, and that will cause them to change their attitude and do things. They're not going to do it because the rest of the world is suffering. They're not going to do it because of the science. They've demonstrated those things are not effective. But they might do it. It's what one might call the Sputnik moment. When the Russians put the Sputnik up, and then the US started NASA and the space race and put a man on the moon in 10 years' time with a huge investment of knowledge and technology and money. That will happen when they have the similar thinking, or the moment when they twig that China is actually going to beat them to this post-fossil fuel era, and that they, being the richest and technologically most advanced country, are going to be left behind. And then they'll turn around and they'll do it for that reason, not for any other reason.
If it's a self-interested reasoning which is going to motivate political action from the superpowers, where does this moral leadership from the poorer, most vulnerable countries come into it?
The moral leadership appeals, I think, to the younger generation, even in the US. Interestingly, I gave an interview just over 24 hours ago on 350.org, this web-based group that a lot of young people, it was created in the US, but there are young people around the world who follow it and do stuff. And even in the last 24 hours, the number of postings that I've had there, positive postings from young Americans saying, you know, we are all with you. We believe that this is right and we want to follow your lead. So it isn't a totally bad situation, but it is difficult. You know, the leaders aren't convinced. Hopefully the next generation of citizens and leaders will respond. I think the rest of the world is well on the way to responding. In Europe, we don't have to make this case. In the rest of the world, everybody knows this. Their response is more sort of, you know, we're in hard times now, so it's difficult for us to do this. We know it's the right thing to do. They don't question that. In the US, they're still questioning whether it's the right thing to do or not.
Is US action going to come fast enough to tackle climate change?
The answer is no. Actions have not come anywhere near quickly enough to tackle climate change. We are going to be having some level of climate change that is now unavoidable and inevitable. The temperature rise over the last century has been 0.8 degrees centigrade. We're locked into probably another 0.7 degrees, so that's a 1.5 degree temperature rise, which means very large numbers of poor people in poor countries are going to be affected quite badly. That's inevitable. That's going to happen. We can still prevent catastrophic climate change of 3 degrees or 4 degrees temperature rise, which we are headed towards, but we don't have to reach if we take action. And if that happens, then it's not just poor countries that need to worry, it's rich countries as well. And then they perhaps will take the action in the next few years. So it's like turning a big oil tanker around. It takes time. We need a few years to do that. As long as they come on board in the next few years, then it's possible. Perhaps in a second Obama term, we might think about it, but don't hold your breath.
And we've got the UN negotiations coming up this month. What comes next? What should we look out for in 2012 as opportunities to move the climate agenda forward?
Well, I would say two things. Firstly, the UN talks are no longer the only game in town. I would say, in fact, they are actually not the most important game in town. The most important game is not the one in one town, but in many, many towns that's taking place all over the world. There are actions taking place at the local level, by communities, by cities, by nation states, by many different actors, private sector. And these are where the action is. This is where the solutions to the problem are occurring, and the Climate Vulnerable Forum is a very good example of a group of countries of forming a coalition of the willing to act, as it were, on this issue. All of them are acting and taking actions, not waiting for agreements to do that. So the action has moved away from the agreement, reaching an agreement, to doing it on the ground. Now, we accept that that's not going to be enough. That has to be ramped up considerably, and an agreement would help us achieve that. But the agreement, the COPs are not necessarily, even the next one after Durban, likely to be the places where we make these agreements. There will be another gathering in 2012 in June at the 20th anniversary of the Earth Summit in 1992, Rio Plus 20 it's called, where countries will again gather and take stock over what has happened over the last 20 years. Some good, some not so good. On the climate front, as I said, we have had the Kyoto Protocol, we've had some actions, but they've not been big enough and fast enough, and we haven't been able to ramp them up. But there have been some actions, and hopefully countries, once they start taking actions, will find that it isn't that difficult to do, it isn't that expensive to do, and indeed it might be beneficial to do. So that's the kind of experience that is in fact happening in the vulnerable countries. Once they start taking actions, they find out it's actually good for development, it's not bad for development.
And just finally, in Bangladesh, what does the future look like 10, 20 years down the line?
Well, Bangladesh is an interesting mix of good and bad, positive and negative. It's 150 plus million people in a tiny area with a hugely dense population. On the other hand, it's a success story in terms of the last 30 years, the population growth rate coming down from somewhere near 3% to somewhere near under 2%, unprecedented to be done anywhere peacefully without huge economic growth and development. So in a Muslim society. So that's a major achievement. Otherwise, we would have had another 20 or 30 million people, babies in this time period. We haven't had them. We have fed the country. The growth in agriculture has kept pace with the growth in population. The country is roughly food self-sufficient. The farmers in this country and the agriculture scientists have been able to ramp up food production in pace with population. We haven't had any famines since the 70s. Major achievement in its own right. And being a very vulnerable country to climate change, it has now been seized by this issue of climate change. There are very high levels of awareness from the Prime Minister down to the ministers to the government and the non-government sector. You can't turn around in Dhaka without bumping into a climate change workshop going on, organized by somebody here, which is good. Very high level of awareness, as I said. It's now in the process of converting that awareness into knowledge and practice and doing things about it and learning how to do those things, because it's a new area, a new subject. Nobody's done this before. So it's going up a learning curve collectively as a society, both within government and outside government. And the Climate Vulnerable Forum and its Bangladesh's chairmanship of it over the next year or so will be another occasion for this learning and sharing across other countries as well.
Salim, thank you very much for speaking to us. What is it that the Maldives are looking to achieve at the Climate Vulnerable Forum?
As you know, we are the people who really started this forum 2 years ago. The first forum of its type was held in Maldives. It's an initiative of President Nasheed. And after that, it was in Kiribati. And now it's in Dhaka. So there's a lot more attention now on this process, so it's very good. And we are very hopeful that this time around, there will be more people will be hearing of the plight of the most vulnerable countries. So it's just to see that our voices are heard. It's not that it's going to be a formal, the findings of this or the deliberations that we had here is going to be formally incorporated into the UNFCCC. But the important thing here is to see that our voices are heard, and this is taken as a document into UNFCCC.
What is it that you expect from Durban, the climate talks that are approaching?
I think all along we have been expecting too much from these meetings, but I think a foundation was laid in Copenhagen for going ahead with this issue, and many things came to light. But the emissions continue to be an issue, because even the developing country emissions are quite high, and it's not only the developed countries that are having this emission issue, but unless we all get together and work out a solution to this, because even if the developed countries stop emitting anything, the developing countries' emissions will be more than enough to completely ruin all our aspirations. So the developing countries also should look at it very seriously. And I think the language has to change now. I think we should be talking more about investing in renewable energy instead of talking about cutting emissions, because the moment you start talking about cutting emissions, then everyone gets on guard that some people are trying to prevent development in the developing countries by cutting emissions. But if you talk about renewable energy production, I think that would sound better, and it would be more acceptable to the world, because then we achieve the same goals. And I think it has to be economically viable in order for it to be really sustainable. And we can go for renewable energy in any form, be it wave energy or wind energy or sun energy or biomass, whatever. And it could be quite successful, because there are many small island developing countries where it is already the investment in solar energy is really quite viable. For example, in Maldives, if we take, our costs of production of energy is so high that renewable energy is really viable in Maldives. So we have several investments lined up for wind as well as for solar. So it should be worthwhile to look at those possibilities, and then a whole lot of economic opportunities then open up, and then it would be better that way if we start talking about investment in renewable energy.
As well as this effort to reframe the negotiations in a more positive way by emphasising the kind of race to the future and renewable energy, there's been a lot of talk here about moral leadership. How do you think that's going to impact the global negotiations?
I think there is enough moral leadership. But the problem is the developed countries and the developing countries will really look at it very seriously only if it becomes a campaign issue, because the leadership is all about politics. And unless it becomes a campaign issue, unless there are demonstrations on the streets, unless it really becomes an issue that the people are deeply concerned and this message goes across and it becomes a deeply rooted campaign issue, nothing would seems to be changing so quickly, so fast. I think everyone knows the requirement, the need for it. But the problem is, since it is not really a campaign issue to get into government the next time around, it will be slow. So if it becomes a campaign issue all over the world, I think it will be much more successful.
Thanks very much for speaking to us.
Thank you. I know you've got to rush. Since we've had the Climate Vulnerability Monitor come out in 2010, and we've in recent days we're seeing the IPCC report on extreme weather coming out. What's the impacts that you're seeing on vulnerable countries around the world already?
Well, I mean, the impact's already large scale, hundreds of thousands of deaths, mainly due to health problems and mainly among children, places like Africa, South Asia, where we are now, Bangladesh, and in the Pacific, small island developing states. Impacts very significant in intensity in what we call highly vulnerable countries. So, for instance, economic impacts related to sea level rise will range from microscopic percentage points of GDP in countries where, you know, they're well equipped to deal with it, or environmentally their vulnerability is less. And small low-lying islands of the Pacific basically destroys the whole economy. And on average, you can have percentage points of GDP that calculate into, 4% per average economic losses per year already now for the Pacific, for instance. So it's a very real situation. I mean, at the moment we had, for instance, here Tuvalu, Kiribati, Pacific Island countries that are suffering from extreme drought on the top of, the fact that they get inundated by tidal waves from just spring tides. And, when you have 3 meters elevation, like was referred to by Ban Ki-moon in the conference today. You don't have much margin vis-a-vis the environment around you, and that relates to all sorts of things like the freshwater lens that's underneath many of the islands. It basically gets penetrated by salt because of the the increasing surges of salt water that come through. I mean, generally just a massive range of impacts. But I think the main thing is that Cancun was basically a year ago now. That was what at the time was already 1 year into kind of fast start financing that we're talking about. That was a commitment made by developed countries to take some sort of responsibility for the industrialization and the effects of that industrialization process. Now 2 years into it, we realize that the $30 billion commitment, only $2.5 billion roughly has actually been dispersed, and there's 1 year left. And worse, there is absolute clarity on the fact that there is no finance promised from the years 2013 to the end of year 2019. So basically, what it looks like is happening is that climate finance, well, if it's currently dispersed at this rate, it will still be being dispersed in 2029. So there's a lot of fear and worry that that's about it. And the process is neither in the negotiations very encouraging, with major industrialized nations looking to be out of a second commitment period to the Kyoto Protocol, with no parallel global agreement in sight. That would send the worst possible signals to the business community. It would wreck basically the market potentially for the clean development mechanism. I think what these countries were very clear on here this week was that there must be a continuation of some form to the Kyoto Protocol. There must be no gap between a first commitment period and a second commitment period. Another thing I think that comes out of the briefing notes that were distributed to the delegations is that the Climate Vulnerable Forum, who reiterated their 1.5 degrees Celsius target, recalling that it was in 2009 in November when President Mohamed Nasheed first convened the Climate Vulnerable Forum, that they were the original ones to agree to a 1.5 degrees Celsius target and also 350 ppm. And subsequently it was AOSIS that took up that position as well. The Climate Vulnerable Forum today firmly reiterated the call for 1.5 degrees, so looking at the 2015 revision of that temperature target. And I think what comes out of the briefing notes is that, you know, it's still highly possible. It looks tough and it's certainly going to be challenging, but one of the key things to making this happen is the international partnership that has to form between developed countries and developing countries. I mean, you have vulnerable countries and, you know, literally, there are 20, well, 19 here at the Climate Vulnerable Forum, but they will go back to their regions where they have neighboring countries who didn't participate, not because of ill will or lack of interest, but just because, you know, we're not convening here a parallel United Nations, we're convening a group of interested parties who are broadly representative. You know, their neighbors amount to, you know, literally over 100 countries around the world who are, you know, in the same situation. They cannot access the technology to transition to the low carbon economy. They don't have basically the resources necessary, financing costs in many of these countries due to country risk, inflationary pressures, and you know, business risks basically mean that when you develop the kind of large-scale businesses that are involved in energy projects, etc., that it becomes a lot more expensive, and it's a lot more difficult for these types of countries to pursue that track. So there's a strong will, and I think it comes out in the declaration that was adopted today that vulnerable countries want to pursue adamantly low-carbon development. It's just there's only so much they can do on their own, and they're doing quite a bit. Bangladesh, for instance, has committed out of its budget $300 million of Bangladesh taxpayer money to their climate change strategy, which includes a low-carbon development plan. But you know, that's quite a commitment for a least developed country whose foreign ministry contains 200 employees well, I come from New Zealand. I think the population of Bangladeshis living outside of Bangladesh is double the size of New Zealand. And I would wonder what our foreign ministry, which accomplishes a lot and is a very good foreign ministry. But anyway, the capacity is a major concern. So if they're going to be able to do this, they need to be able to benefit from that technology and that financing commitment that's been made by developed countries. And you know, the gigaton gap that does exist, provided that we do come to a global agreement based on the Copenhagen commitments that are there now. We're looking at projecting to about 49 gigatons of CO2 equivalent by 2020. If we're going to hit 1.5 degrees Celsius, roughly, the projection made by the UNEP report we need to be more like 39, so we've got 10 gigatons of CO2 that we need to cut. But there's a lot that can be done on basic things like, you know, agreeing very strict rules on land use and forestry. There's work to be done on basically financing will account for millions of gigatons are equivalent of, so several gigatons of CO2 reduction that is not factored into those Copenhagen commitments, the best ones. So that will calculate additional gigatons, and eventually we can close the gap. But one of the key things will be this financing, because that will stimulate basically very low-cost emission reductions around the world. The CDM, if it operated more effectively, would also provide gigaton reductions. If we regulate on top of that so-called bunker fuels, which are basically aircraft and marine emissions that are not under the current Kyoto framework, then basically we're there. We're at 1.5 degrees. But the key thing, I mean, you know, a couple of key decisions need to be made, and one of those is the financing. And so the default on the financing that is happening and the absolute abandon on any form of transparency whatsoever, I mean, basically it is in a large degree, or it cannot at least be said that it isn't, simply transfer of official development assistance that would otherwise have been intended for poverty reduction efforts to so-called fast start climate finance that is actually being spent 10 times slower than it would have been spent if it had been normal ODA for poverty reduction. So it's a complete loss on all fronts, and it's a travesty, in fact, and I think that's why our trustee, the former president of Costa Rica, Jose Maria Figueres, talked of insult, because that's what it is. I mean, here you have a group of countries, a large group of countries that also represent potentially many like-minded countries in their region. So a large proportion of the world, in effect, taking leadership and doing what they can. But there needs to be the international partnership involved in order to make that happen. And I think part of what the initiative is achieving is a higher degree of accountability, because there's a lot of gray area. You'd be surprised that very few of the delegations have been able to have a very clear idea on what the financing situation is, because they'll go into a donor presentation, and the European Union will tell them that they're pledging just 8 billion euros or dollars to the FastUp financing. Fine, okay, across countries like the UK and France and Germany, etc. But in effect, what's happened is that those resources are getting stuck in 20 different funds, bilateral arrangements that we have no transparency on what is actually going on in there. And in the end, the current rate of dispersal will have us seeing it, dispersed up until 2029. So, I mean, yeah, okay, there are pledges and there is money that is being deposited, but also, out of the 30 billion that's been pledged, only 14.5 billion of that has actually been firmly committed, in the sense that governments, including governments of the EU, for instance, have taken fiscal or legal steps to actually separate those resources out from being spent on other things. So basically 2 years into a 3-year period, we can only say that less than half of the pledged money, so what was pledged at Copenhagen, for instance, has actually been set aside for this purpose. And then a fraction of that amount actually being spent in countries or on projects.
Why is it, though, do you think, if we've got climate impacts becoming more and more severe, we've got a clear message from the countries here that this is a huge problem for them, and yet we seem to have rich countries doing little, if nothing? It's almost insulting how little they're doing. What's going wrong?
Well, I mean, the conditions are not easy. There's an economic downturn, obviously. That doesn't make it easier. I think, frankly, there needs to be a little bit of honesty. I think the biggest concern is just that, there is a default going on, and there's a lack of recognition of that. And that, there needs to be a recognition that there's a default. I think people would be understanding of the situation. At the same time, there must be a living up to the commitments. I mean, we know that this level of financing is not adequate anyway. I mean, in terms of the impacts of climate change, I think the Environment Minister of Bangladesh calculated that they need $10 billion at the moment just for Bangladesh. There's one country. We had 19 here today. There's hundreds of others. So I mean, I'm not sure what the time period of those resources were. On average, major international studies have pitched adaptation financing at 50 billion globally. So, these resources are all too low. I mean, the other problem is, I mean, there is a big political picture globally that a lot of America, for instance, has no hope in terms of, at this stage, at least in terms of on the horizon, of committing to anything serious in terms of emission reductions. So that puts many of the other developed countries in a difficult position because they're going it alone. Russia is in a very different situation than it was after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when its heavy industry was disappeared in a matter of months and years, and basically all their emission reductions were already accomplished before they even signed onto the Kyoto Protocol. China is at this stage probably the only developing country that is going to exceed a mean per capita pollution level at 2020. So that's like, for instance, if we want to be at 1.5 degrees with a population that's going to be about 7.7 billion in 2020, we need to be polluting roughly 5.1 tons of CO2 per capita. China will be on current trajectory at 10. India will be at 2. So there's a huge difference between developing countries. But I mean, China seems to be moving in the right direction. They are investing already double in volume what America does on greening their economy, triple the amount of GDP. I think there is a sea change going on, and we're living that. And I think, part of the story, a couple of years ago, you wouldn't have had these countries adopting this declaration, basically. The first CVF declaration was already quite compelling, but this group has almost doubled since then. And I think the interest is even wider.
And how's it going to play out in the UN negotiations, which are coming up in later in this month? How do you think the alliance between these countries and the discussions between these countries will play out there?
Well, I'm not sure if we're calling it an alliance at this stage. More like a group of like-minded of countries who are faced with similar challenges and want to achieve similar outcomes. It is a forum, not an organization. It's a non-binding group of countries, so there's no legal commitment for them to follow up one way or another. But there is that will is there, and the energy of I think these last few days have been a testament to that. And of course, the encouragement of the Secretary General was a major element. How it will play out, there's certainly going to be wider consultation. We're going to, Bangladesh is, and Dara in support of Bangladesh is certainly going to help take this declaration to Durban in a big way, and all of the CVF countries will ultimately fan out across their different negotiating groups and regional groups, and there's going to be a presentation about what went on, what the talks were, and what the reasoning was that led us to that declaration here in Dhaka, and why the countries here feel it was so important, those points. And I think there's a lot of alignment. I mean, generally, even when you look, for instance, at the recent BASIC meeting, I mean, a number of the things are common anyway, like the significance of needing to ensure a second commitment period of Kyoto, the lack of transparency and the need for accountability on finance. So I think there'll be a lot of resonance in Durban for the kind of messages that have come out of here.
You talk about the alignment with BASIC. There's also kind of some tensions. What's the relationship between the Climate Vulnerable Forum, these kind of group of countries that are the most vulnerable, and countries like China and India, who often try and position themselves alongside these vulnerable countries, but actually kind of exist in very different contexts? Do you think they'll be working together, or are they going to increasingly be challenging these major emitters to begin reducing their own emissions?
Well, it's a different, every single country is probably a different perspective. I think a lot of the Climate Vulnerable Forum was reassured by a very interested, favourable statement of the People's Republic of China that was given during the Common Space here, looking to engage in South-South cooperation and support vulnerable countries. And I think, there's a lot of goodwill that exists. I mean, countries like India are ultimately in, quite similar situation to many of these vulnerable countries as well, if on a bigger scale, and it is a much larger economy, and therefore they have a larger capacity to respond. I think, it really depends from country to country, but generally, I mean, the G77. I think it's almost every CVF country is a member of the G77 by just a handful, and I think the CVF is a good thing for the G77 as well. It's ultimately increasing the level of accountability in a way, and it's it's spreading the the low carbon development wider, or it's hoping to at least, and it hopes to succeed on that, and eventually that will be a breakthrough to the green future, which is above all important for developing countries who are drastically disproportionately affected by this problem, and increasingly so. I mean, India, China, I mean, heavy impacts, particularly in India. Yeah.
Thanks very much for speaking to us. We'll look forward to the Climate Vulnerable Monitor coming out next year.
Excellent. Thanks a lot.